Hello, my name is Jacob Lee Burnett, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the history of the wolves of Yellowstone, specifically their ecological impacts on the national park itself. Now, Yellowstone is a national park here in the United States. It's one of the most beautiful, and it was one of the first, and I believe that it is a symbol of the American West. Let's begin. So, Yellowstone was created in the year 1872, and when it was initially created, it had very few regulations on hunting or any environmental policies at all. This caused a lot of people, hunters in particular, to hunt down many species that had existed in the park, including gray wolves, bears, bison, coyotes, pronghorns. Many types of animals that had lived in the park were under attack from hunters, and there was no regulation to stop them. In the year 1901, the U.S. Army would take over administration of the park, and they would protect some of the species, mainly the herbivores, not the predators. Congress would also create the Biological Survey, but this was created in an effort not to protect the predators or any species in general. They were made to protect the cattle and livestock industries that were seeing a decline in their cattle populations because of the wolves and other predators that had existed within national parks in general. So instead of actually protecting these species, they encouraged legislation to be created that would allow for the hunting of bears, mountain lions, and yes, gray wolves as well. These pieces of legislation and, of course, overhunting would allow for the decline of the gray wolf populations, not just within the Yellowstone National Park, within the United States in general. U.S. Army and hunters began tracking down and slaying gray wolves because of the danger that they presented to cattle ranchers and farmers. And between the years 1901 to 1926, the gray wolf populations of Yellowstone had declined severely to the point where it was considered that the gray wolves had been extirpated from the area. That basically means extinct, but only in a certain area. Now, there were reports that there were some lone gray wolves up until the 1970s, but it's generally considered that there were no more giant wolf packs and that the number of possible gray wolves that existed within the park were not able to reproduce properly. Now, this caused severe ecological impacts. Many scientists, biologists, botanists, and ecologists had made comments on the disastrous conditions that Yellowstone was in. There was a loss of multiple tree species, such as aspen and cottonwood, and there was a growth of coyote population, which allowed for the decline of the pronghorn population. And there was also an overgrazing of many plant species, which made the plant population significantly decrease. And all these scientists were worried that Yellowstone was going to erode away. Now, what was one of the main causes for the overgrazing? This handsome devil right here. This is a bull elk, one of the most populous species of elk in Yellowstone National Park and in the Yellowstone area. They are a herbivore. They love eating ferns. They love eating plants. And so because their populations began to rise due to the lack of wolves, they started to eat a little bit too much, which caused the decline of tree and plant populations. Now, even though this slide does say reintroduction efforts, one of the first efforts made to try and fix this problem of the possible erosion was not reintroduction, but instead allowing national park rangers to begin hunting down the elk. Now, they saw a huge success with, killing elk, but this saw little to no impact on the park itself. Sure, it kept it from getting worse, but it didn't allow it to heal. And because there was no evidence that the park was healing, the federal government actually cut the National Park Service's funding, and so they didn't have enough resources, such as food or ammunition, to go out and hunt these elk, which would allow the elk populations to soar once again. Later on, studies from Aldo Leopold, Adolph Murray, and people such as Robert Paines would allow for the conservation of wolves and a better understanding of how ecosystems work, such as the concept of keystone species. The passage of the Endangered Species Act of 1966 and 1973 would allow the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop restoration plans for all species considered endangered. And yes, at the time, this would consider gray wolves as endangered species. Later on in 1995, after some disputes with the farm bureaus of Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana, they would come to an agreement that they would get wolves from Jasper National Park in Canada, and they would use them to try and repopulate the wolf population in Yellowstone. In 1995, they would get 14 wolves from Jasper National Park, and then a year later, they would get 17 other wolves from a different wolf pack. Now, what are the impacts that it has on us today? Well, Whenever they initially introduced them, the elk population started to decrease significantly, and this stopped the overgrazing and it allowed the forest to heal. Also in 2006, gray wolves were taken off of the endangered species list, and now Yellowstone is one of the most popular, most visited, and most beautiful parks of the United States. And there's the proof for it. That is just one picture, and you're able to see so much within it. That gorgeous river, the amazing greenery, the tall trees, the amazing mountains. This is the type of ecosystem that we have here today in the great state of Wyoming because of the reintroduction efforts of the gray wolves. The reason why I chose this topic is because I love nature. Wolves are one of my favorite animals, and I love understanding the relationships that species have with their environments. Just think about this. Taking one species away from this giant piece of land allowed for its almost erosion, and then reintroducing it allows us to see what we see today. These are my sources. The pictures come from wallpapercave.com, and thank you for listening.